so we do have our first diagnosed case of Ebola in the United States. There is someone in a hospital in Dallas. He was in Liberia, came back from Liberia on September 19th, developed symptoms a couple days later. And then as of this morning, it now sounds like there might be a second person. I'm not 100% sure about that, but might be. Okay. Everyone's freaking out already. When this Ebola thing started, you were on the show that day and you gave us a good cleanup of it. So as our resident science person here, all right, this is the first diagnosed one. Obama said it probably wasn't going to happen. The president's supposed to be in charge of absolutely everything at all times. How freaked out should we be right now?
Not at all.
No,
we shouldn't be freaked out at all. Like, we don't live in West Africa. I think the people of West Africa should be very nervous and they should be very careful. And there are a lot of things that are happening right now in West Africa to try to contain the outbreak of this infection. And unfortunately, they're not working to the extent that we would like them to be working because of all sorts of pressures that we can get into. But in the United States, the level of care that we offer is absolutely superior. Every single hospital is equipped with isolation wards. Doctors know how to isolate individuals, quarantine individuals to prevent further contamination. And I think that one thing that we have to remember about Ebola is that we need to keep kind of these two words separate in our heads, which is how contagious is the disease and how infectious is the disease. It's not a very contagious disease, but it is highly infectious, which means if you come in contact with it, it's likely that you will contract the virus. But it's not very likely that people come in contact with it because you can only get it through bodily fluid exchange. Okay, so you calm down my rather hysterical intro. Stop watching Contagion.
Stop watching Contagion.
The thing in Contagion was airborne,
right? Which
is why it spread so quickly. Ebola is not airborne.
Okay, so the media. You are in the media, Lissette. How do we present this without going crazy? Because that's the thing. Like, I was watching all the cable news channels. I was flipping through them all last night, and there is this, like, they have to sort of push. Yeah, there's a mass hysteria because we have one guy, and again, not airborne. But I do want to get back to something about that. But how should the media handle this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a question of how should the media, it's not just how should the media handle it, but how is it handling it and why? So as you alluded to, a lot of times the media needs to sensationalize stories in order to get clicks, right? If you say something like, oh, there's some disease out there, it's killed a couple people, no one's gonna click on that. So in some sense, the reason why people read articles is because of fear, because they have an emotional reaction to it. So,
oh, believe me, for the thumbnail on this video, we're gonna put a zombie shooting blood out of its mouth.
But it's
so, you gotta get clicks.
But it's really unfair. And then the other thing too that I think the U.S. is being criticized of is being slightly, American-centric, right? We're focusing on Americans, and when Americans are inflicted with the disease or contract the virus, we're up in arms, right? So we didn't do much about, unfortunately, we didn't do much about the Ebola outbreak in West Africa until our American U.S. aid workers that were there contracted the disease, right? And that's when everybody kind of went up in arms, was like, oh my gosh, like American people. And all of a sudden the CDC came up with like, oh, we have an experimental vaccine and they've been cured.
Well, here's the thing. And now I have to interject. America was doing a lot in West Africa when we first heard about this.
In terms of the media, however, it wasn't covered different.
The general public didn't care.
Right.
And that's a problem. And the media wasn't covering it appropriately, I don't think. But
basically, we didn't hear about it until those people got sick.
Sure, but the CDC was working very hard, and our members of the World Health Organization. There was a lot of American research that was happening. There was a lot of aid that was going over there. It just wasn't that big of a story.
Yeah. So we know it's not airborne. So how did the doctors and the aid workers there? You would think, like, I picture, again, this is because I'm watching Contagion and I'm watching, what was the other one with what was that other one?
Well, there's
Contagion.
the book, The Hot Zone. Oh, you're thinking Outbreak.
Outbreak, right. Like, they got all those things on, and like, so if it's not airborne, how did doctors who are taking care of these people, it seems like it's pretty hard to contract, actually.
It's not hard to contract. It's okay.
Good, clean it up.
It's very infectious, which means that if you come into contact with somebody who's exhibiting symptoms, it's very likely that you're going to contract the disease. Because it is contracted via bodily fluids, and because individuals who are symptomatic are often vomiting, they have diarrhea, and they may bleed. That's actually a symptom it is a hemorrhagic fever, and on autopsy you do see a lot of hemorrhaging within the body, or some hemorrhaging. I think it's been overblown, the idea that people are bleeding from every orifice. That's just not what Ebola patients look like.
Yeah.
But if somebody's coughing, they're getting virus all over their hands, all over their arms. If an aid worker is, touches their skin and then brushes their hands against their eyes or something, that's how it's getting into their bloodstream. So it is very easy to contract it if you're in direct contact with somebody who's symptomatic.
Yeah. Okay, and unfortunately, too, many of the facilities and hospitals in West Africa are being overwhelmed. They simply cannot handle the number of cases. So what's happening is that some patients are vomiting on the floor. There have been accounts where they're simply just not being taken care of. So there's an issue of control here as well, and being able to take care of the people that have the disease.
And this is also a zoonotic disease. This is something that we have to keep in mind too, which means that there's all these different terms when we talk about epidemiology, like the index case here in America. This new person in Dallas is an index case, meaning that they contracted the disease and potentially spread it while in America, whereas those 2 aid workers that were brought over, they weren't index cases. They were already sick. They were brought over for treatment and they were in isolation the whole time. But when we talk about the way that the disease is being contracted in West Africa, there is person-to-person infection, but it's also a zoonotic disease, which means that people get it directly from infected chimpanzees and gorillas. So the way that Ebola got its hooks in West Africa is because people were eating bushmeat, and that continues to happen. There's been a lot of educational efforts, but we're going to continue to see new cases occurring also in West Africa, source cases. We don't see that here in the United States.
Okay, so I'm glad you're making that distinction. So clearly we have better health practices here, it's safer here, et cetera, et cetera. But what can we do in terms of, this guy was in Liberia and then got on a plane. So again, not to promote hysteria, but should we be doing something a little bit differently? Shouldn't he have maybe been quarantined for a couple days? If you're coming from this country, the border part of this is the part that seems odd to me.
Yeah, I mean, yes, should we be doing more? Perhaps, but logistically, I think it's really difficult to quarantine people because the symptoms can take up to 21 days to manifest.
Yeah,
so what are you going to do logistically?
Right, again, he was fine when he came back.
Exactly, and they are screening people for fever before they come onto the plane. Now, I guess on the flip side, or on the positive side, people are not contagious until they manifest symptoms. So for the 4 days in which he was, presenting these symptoms, then perhaps people could have contracted the disease. But when he got on the plane, when he got off the plane, no one there was at risk of contracting the virus. So
which is why we're not going to see it spread across the country.
Okay. I'm also watching The Strain right now, which probably doesn't help my. That's why I'm glad I have both.
2 more things before you wrap this segment up. The one thing is that there's a really great book. It's called Spillover by David Quammen, and it's a really good answer to Richard Preston's The Hot Zone, which kind of overblows the symptoms of Ebola. And the second thing is everybody should go on their Apple TVs and download the PBS app and watch the recent episode of Frontline, where a reporter actually goes into the field in Sierra Leone and gets a firsthand look of one of the Doctors Without Borders hospitals there. You can see how overwhelmed they are. You can see, the dire straits that they're in, exactly what they're dealing with in West Africa. But you'll also see it'll humanize it a little bit for you. You'll see patients with Ebola. You'll see that they're not bleeding out of every orifice. They're real people. They look like they have the flu. They're very sick, but it might take some of the fear away as well.
Yeah, okay, so then last question on this, just clean up the one other thing that I think everyone is sort of thinking but not asking, which is what causes something like this to jump from the way it is now to airborne? Because that's the part where everyone will freak. So can you just clean that up? And then I think we did something pretty sane and decent here.
They don't. They don't. Disease,
it doesn't. Well, there you go.
Pathogens work the way that pathogens work. There's no reason to believe that the transmission, the way that this disease is transmitted, will change. This is a very ancient disease. We see many cases of it historically from, as I said before, species to species. So somebody eats a chimpanzee that was infected, they get infected, and then they can then transmit it to people who are close to them. There's absolutely no reason to believe that it'll ever be airborne, that'll ever be a risk.